read a study. Given that our book club here had just read a study of the dangers and the delights of ChatGPT, I thought I would ask it how it might introduce our speaker today. Here's how it began. Okay, can you hear better if I stand even closer? Okay, so here's how ChatGPT began its introduction of Neil. Dr. Neil Besner brings a rare combination of scholarly depth and institutional leadership to his work. Over the course of his career, he has contributed to academic research while also helping guide universities through periods of growth and internationalization. His perspective reflects both rigorous scholarship and practical experience. End of quote. Now, all that is absolutely true. It's a little generic for someone who is anything but generic. You see, Neil was born in Montreal. He grew up in Brazil. He was educated in LA, Regina, and Vancouver. He taught in Spain and Calgary and UBC before settling in Winnipeg, where he taught in the English department for over 20 years. That's not very generic in my books. His scholarly interests are equally non-generic, for he's worked on a range of writers from Saul Bellow to Bob Dylan. Given his bilingual background, he's also worked on fiction in translation, especially South American, and has himself translated from the Portuguese into English. He's also co-edited multiple collections of essays on Canadian and Brazilian literary relations. Now, he's well known in our field for his work on two particular authors, however. The American poet Elizabeth Bishop, who lived for over a decade in Brazil, and the Canadian Parisian expat short story writer Mavis Gallant. More on her from him in a moment. Though a major critic writing on the short story form, Neil was also responsible for selecting and editing works by 22 Canadian poets. And reaching outside the Academy, he was a regular reviewer for the Winnipeg Free Press. Now, in his spare time, during those years teaching at the University of Winnipeg, Neil was the exemplary university citizen. He moved from service as department chair to dean of humanities to provost and vice president academic. I think you get the picture. Neil is anything but a generic academic. And he's here to talk to us today on his life and works with Mavis Gallant. Neil. Sorry.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah. And am I looking the right way into the screen? It's good? Okay. I can. Oh. Oh, so I can. My God. Okay. Um, um, Linda, thank you for the generous introduction. I've never been introduced by Chat GPT. Yeah, never. This is a first. Um, exactly. And thanks to Pat Brubaker, wherever she is. There you are. Thank you, Pat. She first told me about this series a while ago when we met at a mutual friend's for dinner. Linda, I think we first met several times in the early to mid 80s at the Learneds, I think. And then I remember inviting you to speak at the University of Winnipeg in winter 1988. And I remember your wonderful evening talk there, including afterwards Dennis Cooley, poet, quizzing you in his friendly way about your views of the authenticity of voice in lyric poetry and your disarming replies to him. Bob Croach and Bob Enright and Dave Arneson, these are poets, were there as well, seated near the front. It was a warm crowd on a cold Winnipeg winter evening, but I digress. Linda told me that many of you come from areas other than the humanities and that you might not be overly familiar with Mavis Gallant. So let me try to address that, first of all. Gallant was born Mavis Young in Montreal in 1922, and she died in her early 90s in Paris in 2014. She had lived in Paris by then for some 60 years. She has been widely acknowledged in the English-speaking world, not just in Canada, as one of the 20th century's finest short story writers. I only mention this as background because Gallant did write two novels in quotation marks, but one of Gallant's novels was actually an amalgam of several short stories. This isn't the place to make this argument, except in shorthand, but for now, trust me, please. The short story as a form is in fact a much older, more venerable form than the upstart novel, with roots stretching back to the fable, the epic poem, and the oral tradition. I can elaborate later if you like. For now, I only want to emphasize that Gallant wrote stories and a few glorious novellas, another complex and misapprehended form. Mavis Gallant was that rara avis, a pure short story writer. There aren't many. In English, think of Catherine Mansfield. In Russian, arguably Chekhov. In French, de Maupassant. All of this is to try to disabuse us of the commonly held notion that the short story is an apprenticeship form on the way for major writers, real writers, to the master form, the novel. Not true. In Canada, think Margaret Atwood or Guy Vanderhaeghe, both accomplished writers of stories as well as strong novelists. In the US, think of the great stories first of the big three, I call them the big three, Faulkner, Hemingway, Fitzgerald. In the UK, think of D.H. Lawrence's stories. And two facts for the record. For many decades, beginning in the 1950s, Gallant's stories were published nearly exclusively in The New Yorker, where something like 116 of her stories appeared. That's remarkable. That's a remarkable achievement. And second, this is where I'll begin. Gallant began her writing career in 1944 at the age of 22 as a journalist for the Montreal Standard, now long defunct. She worked there for 6 years before leaving for Europe in 1950 and settling in Paris a few years later. A last preliminary observation, no one writing in English over the last 75 years has written more searching, more scintillating stories than has Gallant about the fabric of post-war Europe. Not that she didn't also write luminous stories about Canada, she did. See, for starters, the stories collected in Home Truths, Selected Canadian Stories, which was published in 1981. Okay, let's go back to 1979. I'd recently finished 2 years, 1976 to 1978, as what was then called a sessional lecturer at UBC. Linda, for one, will be familiar with the role, if memory serves. She first taught as a sessional at McMaster way back when. I've just confirmed this with her. The English department at UBC was very large then, with a cohort in 1976 of 26 sessionals and a professorate of some 120. Because I loved teaching then as now, I loved being there. I met Bill New there. I'll tell you who he is in a second. I met Bill New there in 1976. He told me then correctly that this is what he said: you will not get to first base without a PhD, as he put it. He told me to think of writing a dissertation as if I were writing 3 or 4 long-term papers. He intended no disrespect of any kind for Gallant, for my project, or for the PhD. He just wanted to see me get it done. He was severe and he was kind. So, 1979, a sunny summer afternoon, I was sitting outside Bill's corner office on the 3rd floor of Buchanan Tower. We had recently, in a preliminary way, agreed that I would write my dissertation on Malcolm Lowry's short stories. I'd read some Lowry, and I knew that Bill had written a short book on him. To this day, Bill is now 86. Bill is the most prolific writer in any language, in or out of academia, that I know of. At 86, he is still going strong. Some of you probably know Bill, but I was nervous about Lowry, and I said so to Bill. He glanced at me. No one has more penetrating eyes than does Bill. And he nodded and he said, Lowry is an abyss. I was passing my time outside his office by reading a paperback I'd picked up. It was called The End of the World and Other Stories. It was published in 1974. It was one of those famous new Canadian library paperbacks. You remember them. The introduction was by Robert Weaver. The general editor of this first incarnation of the New Canadian Library was Malcolm Ross, a fellow Winnipegger. The book collected 13 Mavis Gallant stories, beginning with the title story of her first book of stories, The Other Paris, which was where I began reading, sitting outside Bill's office. That story was published in The New Yorker in 1953. Gallant's first book of stories, The Other Paris, came out in 1956. As I was writing this talk, I took the NCL collection down from my shelf. Its pages are now mildly yellowing. Its cover, as you can see, is a chaste white with its title in declarative yellow letters. It's the first form of the New Canadian Library. There's a background photo of an indistinct crowd. I'd never read anything by Gallant. The Other Paris stopped me in my tracks. When I went into Bill's office a half hour later, I told him that I wanted to write my dissertation on Mavis Gallant. Bill said, sure, I could write what he called an exploratory thesis. It would be the first PhD on Gallant. That meant, this was Bill, that I was to read everything that Gallant had written up until 1982, including all of her work for the Montreal Standard, and to compile as a major element of the dissertation what he called a comprehensive bibliography of her work, including all of her journalism, which I'm going to talk about in a second, her other essays and reviews, of course, all of the short stories and the 2 novels, the drama, she wrote 1 play, and also everything about her work up until 1982. I finished the dissertation in 1982. I learned the meaning of the term terminus ad quem. Gallant's Montreal Standard work, she wrote for the newspaper from 1944 to 1950, comprises over 125 feature pieces published in different sections of the newspaper, including Rotogravure, renamed Photo News in 1948, and the weekly Standard magazine, as well as a column entitled On the Air that ran from October 1947 to May 1948. This was commentary on radio shows, then as now an important component of Canadian literary life. So beginning in the fall of 1979, I read Gallant's Montreal Standard work with mounting excitement. Why? Because it quickly began to appear to me that many of her short stories drew on her writing in the Standard, not literally, but in other, more important ways. Beginning with that first story I'd read outside of Bill's office, The Other Paris. Okay, on November 12th, 1981, Gallant came to UBC to read. She had just won the Governor General's Award for Home Truths, Selected Canadian Stories, probably the wrong book for this recognition and probably for the wrong reasons, but okay. By broad consensus, her finest book is From the 15th District, a novella and 8 short stories published in 1979. Home Truths is an excellent collection, but it lacks the range and depth of From the 15th District. From its title forward, the 1981 book was read principally by Canadians as Canadian. Despite Gallant's own acidic observations, she could be very acidic about what that might mean. Gallant wrote elsewhere that she found it telling that expatriate, E-X-P-A-T-R-I-A-T-E, is often misspelled in Canada as expatriot, P-A-T-R-I-O-T. Home Truths is prefaced by Gallant's An Introduction, which concludes with the finest passage of non-fictional prose Gallant ever wrote, a passage about her so-called Lynette Muir stories. More on this later. After her reading, Gallant was taken to lunch at the UBC Faculty Club. A gray and rainy Vancouver winter day, fog. The faculty members, Bill New among them, insisted that I sit next to Gallant. I was in awe of her. I was at that time fumbling with the first chapter of the dissertation. I'd now read all of her short stories to 1981, her 2 novels, all of her Montreal Standard work, and her other nonfiction, including the best reporting in English on the Paris uprising of 1966, written by anyone, then or now. This is her 2-part essay. I urge you to read it. In consecutive issues of The New Yorker in the fall of 1968, it's entitled Reflections, The Events in May, A Paris Notebook, parts 1 and 2. Terrific piece. I brought all of her books to lunch for her to sign. One was a paperback proof. All I could find at that time. She raised her eyebrows at me and commented tersely at this version of her novel, A Fairly Good Time, 1970. But she signed them all in the upright, uniform hand, unvarying, that I came to know well. In her handwritten letters and cards, the uniform writing always arches every midline slightly and symmetrically. It's very distinctive. Some small talk circled the table. I was tongue-tied. With Gallant's eye on me, I felt I had to say something astute and quickly. She saw that I was nervous. She asked what I proposed to write. I stuttered something inane. She suggested I write a letter. I instantly agreed. I got through lunch, abetted by Bill New, who at one point grinned and patted my hand. I've forgotten what else I said, but I remember the gesture. He meant to assure me that I would not die at lunch. The letter I wrote to Gallant, 4 pages, typed, single-spaced, is dated February 1, 1982, so about a month, some time later. It was returned to me 4 weeks later, with Gallant's carefully handwritten comments in both margins of all 4 pages, including a page and 2/3 of handwritten commentary beginning on the back of the second last page and continuing onto the back of the last page. Believe me, I'm not lying to you. It's at the University of Manitoba now. It's impossible to discuss all of her comments here. Gallant answered in detail a series of questions I posed about her use of first-person narration, about her use of the present tense, about which published stories set in Germany and why she'd excluded from her 1973 book of stories, The Pegnitz Junction. It's her own favorite among her books, she always said. But a fair summary of her comments would point to Gallant's major directive to me throughout. Do not conflate my journalism with my fiction. Let several examples of that instruction stand for the whole. At the very top of the first page, clearly Gallant had by that time read the whole letter. She writes, "Dear Mr. Besner, one day a woman objected to Matisse. No living woman ever looked like the woman in that painting. Matisse replied, I haven't shown you a woman, I've shown you a painting. Do remember this when you try to link my journalism with my fiction, and remember, they were not underlined concurrent. Best luck, MG." To this day, that opening comment seems to me to be polite and right, pointed and firm. And her comment on the top of page 2, left-hand margin, likewise. In the letter I'd written, in the other Paris, Carol Fraser, the protagonist, goes through an implicit but clear process of shaping her actual experience of Paris into a coherent fiction, accurate but untrue, as the narrator puts it. I quoted this passage from the story. Gallant wrote in the margin, I am quite particular about this, but fiction is fiction, underlined. Reading her comments in March 1982, I nodded silently in agreement. To this point in the letter, I was thrilled. I was chuffed that Gallant had A, taken the time to write back so quickly and fully, and B, very pleased with myself for agreeing with her observations. Until I got a bit further down the second page of my letter, where I had written as follows: I approach your short stories through two basic categories. Objective elements, your stories as examples of what I'm calling documentary realism in the best sense. And here I use some of your Montreal standard writing to show your range of interests as a journalist, interests which are reshaped and transformed into fictional elements. With the other Paris, for example, I suggest that you draw on your 1947 article in the Montreal Standard, Is Romance Killing Your Marriage? And I go on from there. Gallant had underlined documentary realism, and then the entire passage, beginning with The Other Paris and ending with the title of her 1947 standard piece, Is Romance Killing Your Marriage? Her comment in the right-hand margin abruptly shifted tone. She said this: if you suggest any such thing, my response will be immediate and terrifying legal action. Bear in mind that in February 1982, I was 32 years old, a PhD student with two small children, 3 and 1. I have long thought that this period in a PhD is an adult's most vulnerable. Gallant's comment brought me up short big time. I took the letter to Bill New and showed him what Gallant had said. He laughed and he said to me, "You're on your own." It took me a long time to understand that Gallant wasn't serious and that she was serious. In any event, I went ahead and I entitled Chapter 2 of my thesis, The Other Paris, Memories, Fictions Against History's Reports, and I included a 17-page analysis of The Other Paris in relation to her feature in the Montreal Standard, Is Romance Killing Your Marriage? I repeated with a few variations and additions that 1983 analysis in the 1988 book I wrote, based largely on the thesis, with the revisions, expansions, and additions. Gallant had by then published another book of stories, Overhead in a Balloon, published in 1985. Then, 6 and 7 years later, two things happened. In 1988, Gallant gave a talk in Canada to the Writers' Trust, that year's annual lecture. Every year they had a featured lecture in which she spoke at length. This is the main subject of her talk, about her standard years, 1944 to 1950. Second, in 1989, a card came to me from Gallant. She wrote that she had recently been at a book fair in Gothenburg, Sweden, where she'd come across a copy of my book and read it. Thankfully, I'm quite sure she never read the 1983 thesis. Thank God. With its categorical distinctions between history and memory and its unctuous pronunciations, it's had me wincing for over 4 decades. In her card, Gallant wrote that she'd liked the book and found nothing she could disagree with, quote unquote. Although, of course, quote, our points of departure were quite different. Of course, she's right. In the 1988 talk, Gallant commented much more extensively about the relations rather than the distinctions she'd insisted on in 1982 between her journalism and her fiction. Repeatedly in the talk, she refers to her fiction, her stories, that rich alloy of irony, deadpan humor, minutely reported detail, and lyrical intensity that is hers alone in relation to her early journalism. Throughout the lecture, Gallant reveals how important her 6 years writing at the Standard were for her. Everywhere, she makes pungent observations about every facet of a writer's work in both forms and about the relation between the forms, about reporting facts and narrating fiction, about time and voice, about description and plot and causation, about irony, about, of course, memory. A quick digression for Gallant. French novelist Marcel Proust's myriad deployments, implicit and explicit, of memory in his 3,000-page masterpiece, Remembrance of Things Past in English, are largely why I believe he was her very favorite writer, as she said all the time. I finally got around to reading it in 2001. It's a magnificent book, and I urge you to leave this lecture and read it right away. In her 1988 talk, Gallant understands her years at the Standard as inseparable from her early post-war experience as a young woman determined to be a writer and struggling to make a living in the Montreal of the era. It's just as the war is ending, yes. And she makes it clear that she did not see the Standard years as drudgery. This is what she says. Often when I'm being interviewed, the reporter will try to make me say that I wasted years of creative energy on journalism, or that I was forced to turn out dreary pieces that bored me, and that I was and have remained resentful. It is not true. From the bright June day when I was hired until the day that I left, I liked what I was doing. I was not made to write anything that I thought cheap or demeaning. Rereading and thinking about her journalism from the 1940s in 1979 and again in 2026, it also quickly becomes clear from her choice of subjects that above all, she was insatiably curious, which is why the pieces she wrote for the Standard cover such a wide range of subjects. As she puts it in 1988, it seems to me now that I moved into every corner of the city and the province, and she did. Writers, French and English, and their works, painters and theirs, street kids, hoodlums, war brides, doctors, Canada and Canadians, social workers, children and their parents, not the other way around, unwed mothers, raw mining towns, jazz. Her longest piece in the Standard was about jazz. Book prices, immigrants and expats and displaced persons, Freud and dreams, Sartre and existentialism, mercy killings, murder, comedy, horror, old people's homes, prisoners of war, and post-war homecomings. Gallant recalls that she entered newspaper work as a presenter of facts, with few of my own opinions on view, and yet I can see now that I was always thinking as a writer of fiction. She says, in 1988, much of my early fiction came straight from my newspaper work. The bored wives in a construction camp in northern Quebec, the war bride on a slow train to Abitibi, the angry storekeeper in the east end of Montreal were based on events and people observed. But in the 1988 lecture, Gallant also notes that as a journalist, this is what she writes, you can't afford irony. You can't be anything but dispassionate with the facts, which it is your job to record and report. Inescapably, however, and in retrospect demonstrably, she was, as she puts it, already thinking as a writer of fiction, which is why the 1947 Montreal Standard article, Is Romance Killing Your Marriage?, which got me into so much trouble, seems in retrospect to have looked ahead so clearly to the other Paris. Like so many stories, Gallant stories, early and late, the other Paris turns on the dynamic dance between romantic delusion, almost defeated by historical reality, but preserving its American protagonist's willful naivete in the face of the facts. In the article, the steadily rising divorce rate in North America. In the story, the stark lives of French characters barely surviving in a shabby post-war Paris. Shabby is one of Gallant's favorite words. Shabby post-war Paris, while Americans abroad, despite the evidence before their eyes, pursue their romantic fantasies. Aside from the connections, and there are many, between Gallant's stories and her writing at the Standard, it's also true that she remembers that the subject matter itself first attracted her as a writer, as she puts it. She comments, "It was as a writer, I think, that I first became interested in the daily life of a downtown urban child, a real child, not someone developed in my imagination. That observation leads directly to Gallant's sharply observed distinction in her 1988 lecture between fiction and reporting. She says, one of the great differences between fiction and reporting is that the author of a work of fiction has to know more than meets the eye. But this was a newspaper feature, and I could not allow myself to guess or imagine or add anything to pure description. Many years later, Gallant writes as follows: fiction consists almost entirely of what does not meet the eye. Otherwise, it is not worth a second's consideration. I think that's true. In her first piece for The Standard, Gallant records, without opinion, judgment, guessing, or imagination, the daily life of Johnny, a pugnacious downtown urban kid. Her portrait of Johnny is inseparable from its setting in wartime Montreal, where kids play at soldiers in the streets. For its part, the Montreal Standard piece Stalag Diary, published in mid-July of 1945, shows us how powerfully a Canadian soldier's record of his imprisonment affected Gallant. And it anticipates her piece 2 weeks later, Report on a Repat, following the difficult return home of another Canadian soldier. It seems natural now to read both pieces, like several other Montreal Standard articles in this domain, as early explanations of Gallant's later major fictional engagement with the war and with post-war Europe, particularly but by no means exclusively pre- and post-war Germany. To suggest that she is merely practicing or rehearsing misses the point. Her standard pieces are early signals of the directions her stories will take, because Gallant then, as later, seeks to discover in these reports something vital to her. What is the nature of these experiences? What form will best address the questions that arise about a soldier's return, about a soldier's wartime diary? What animates the women who become war brides in this era? The women who married Canadian soldiers abroad and came to Canada with them after the war. How are these women perceived in their new country? Look at how Gallant opens her standard piece of March 2, 1946, Don't Call Me War Bride. Quote, after a year in Canada, Elizabeth Mackenzie is surprised to find people still calling her a war bride. The term never bothered her until she heard it used in a certain tone of voice. Now, she says, it sends chills up and down her spine. It's easy to discern how, for Gallant, Mackenzie's unsettling experience might have aroused an important facet of the young reporter's curiosity, a facet that would endure and develop into an abiding fictional preoccupation. Or think of how, in her August 28, 1948 column, DP Test Case a Failure, Gallant, at 26 years old, might understand the experiment of 100 Polish girls being brought over to Canada to work in a textile plant. This is what she writes. The girls were bound by 2-year contracts to the Dion spinning mill at Saint-Georges-de-Beauce. Their salary for the first month was to be based on the minimum wage of Quebec for that area, 19 cents an hour. Anything they received over that was to be kept in the bank by Dion and turned over to them at the end of their 2-year stay. Critics of the scheme felt it was a unique way of handling immigration. Its proponents claimed it was an act of mercy to the displaced girls and a means of populating the country with stable labor. Now, other firms are rumored to be following Dion's lead and planning to bring in groups of young girls to work in their industries. Has the idea been successful? The answer is no. Of the original 100 girls, only 47 are left. And by the time you read this, there may be even fewer. This is all Gallant. Some left with Dion's consent. Many more merely packed up and went. Dispassionately, as the report reads, the tone is unmistakable. Later, Gallant's stories address myriad scenes of displacement and relocation beneath a related mask, at once unmasked by irony, drawing on the kind of dispassionate reporting she was required to write for the Standard. Readers of Gallant's stories set in Canada, like those collected in Home Truths, will recall how frequently they counterpose a Canadian state of mind against European worldviews. So Gallant often says that she grew up very European-minded. It's true. These representations go well beyond her early depictions of the English and French Canada that she evokes so brilliantly in standard pieces like Why Are We Canadians So Dull? March 30th, 1946. You can find an early, more lighthearted, more tongue-in-cheek version of the subject, prototypical in its way, but looking forward nevertheless to the sharper and more substantial comments about Canada and Canadians that Gallant makes in later years, such as these reflections in a 1982 interview on CBC Radio. She says, I am constantly assured that Canadians no longer know what they are, or what to be Canadian should mean. For want of a satisfactory definition, a national identity has been mislaid. The most polite thing I can say about this is that I don't believe it. Her favorite way of dismissing something in person was to say, that was a load of codswallop. Or in a 1978 interview in a magazine, this dismissal. She wrote, I have no identity problem concerning Canada. In fact, I don't believe anyone has. It's something people like to imagine about themselves because it sounds tense and stormy and romantic. Pivot from this central focus on Canada and Canadians to consider Gallant's career-long contemplation of children's lives. With its probing of fairy tales, horror, and children's fears, the standard piece Give the Kid a Gory Story can be read, should be read, as an anticipation of later Gallant stories. In fact, the fairy tale of Jorinda and Jorindel, mentioned in the 1946 article, reemerges in fictional form as Gallant's story of that title, first published in the New Yorker in 1959 and then collected in Home Truths as a selected Canadian story over 20 years later. Okay, The Making of a Hoodlum, published on October 4th, 1950, was Gallant's final piece for the Montreal Standard before she left for Europe. As has been much discussed, Gallant saw the age of 30 as a trench, is what she called it. If she had not crossed it, not begun to make a living as a writer by then, she would consider herself to have failed. That's old news. Less old, maybe, is the uncanny contemporaneity of this, her last subject for the Standard. Like today's Montreal, for those of you who know Montreal, Gallant's Montreal in the 40s was home to a many-layered underworld. Gallant was fascinated by the intricate history of Johnny Young, a small-time hoodlum and drug peddler who never made it to the big time, but finally, after innumerable offenses, was the first in Montreal to be convicted under a new law of being a habitual criminal. Gallant constructs the architecture of Young's life, and he can be read as minor key kin to the real-life, latter-day Vito Rizzuto family in Montreal and its predecessors, the mob that had begun to circulate in the Montreal of Gallant's time, to populate its restaurants and bars and casinos, to animate its lifetime, its nightlife. Johnny Young did not drink, did not smoke. He kept an annotated index of his drug clients. He was every bit as local and familiar an inhabitant of Gallant's Montreal as Philip Surrey, the painter who hired her at the Standard when she was 22, after turning her away when she was 18, asking her to come back later. She did, and he did. You might want to think that the two Johnnies of Gallant's first and last Standard pieces, Johnny the Street Kid and Johnny Young the Hoodlum, were cut from the same cloth. They are not. In the 6 years between their portraits, Gallant has grown immeasurably as a writer, and her last piece shows it in every paragraph. By 1950, the reporter and the writer have become nearly indistinguishable. Okay, the end. About a year and a half after meeting Gallant for the first time at UBC in November 81, I spent the better part of a June day with her in Montreal, summer 1983. I'd just finished the dissertation. She was staying at the Ritz, that bastion of the Montreal of my grandparents' day, of Gallant's day a generation later, too. In the morning, she walked east with me on Sherbrooke to the south side of this on the south side of the street. She wanted to show me where she'd lived with her parents when she was a girl, across from McGill, where the McCord Museum stands today. We had lunch nearby with too much red wine in a restaurant in what was then known as the Ghetto, just east of McGill. This was over 40 years ago, when many of the stolid, low gray stones of the neighborhood still stood intact. Some still stand today. We walked west up Prince Arthur from Durocher. At 623 Prince Arthur, I showed her where I'd lived 12 years earlier when I was an undergraduate at McGill. Monsieur Bastien, the landlord, was still sweeping the steps. I introduced him to Madame Mavis Gallant, an écrivaine célèbre. She ignored that, was instantly more familiar with him than I was, as she'd been in a taxi earlier when the driver had been eating a strawberry and she'd asked where he'd got such a beautiful piece of fruit. Always in an easy French, not a bit out of place in Montreal, unlike my correct mumbling. Why this personal interlude? Because, properly, where this account of the importance of Gallant's standard days should close is via her 6 semi-autobiographical Lynette Muir stories. It's her own much-quoted description. That's what she called them. And because Montreal, in its way, is the chief character in Gallant's early journalism. No writer, I know that there are going to be people here that object to this, but I stand by my claim. No writer has recalled the ghost of that Montreal as Gallant has done, both in her standard pieces and later in her stories, or so closely named her purpose. The Lynette Muir stories, first published in the 1970s, returned to the Montreal Gallant wrote about in her standard pieces, and an earlier city, which Lynette powerfully evokes as the Montreal of her childhood and adolescence. A digression like Gallant herself did, Lynette left Montreal as a young girl and returns to Montreal from the US at 18 after having been away on her own, entirely on her own, after having been away for some years. That in itself is a very long story. The way in which the intimations that led her to the Lynette Muir stories arose for Gallant emerges in the most poetic and haunting prose passage Gallant ever wrote. It's near the end of an introduction to Home Truths. She had been, Gallant advises in the introduction, reading virtually nothing for 2 years except documents and books about the Dreyfus case. Gallant was then preparing to write a biography of Alfred Dreyfus, the Jewish officer falsely accused of treason in 1894 and finally exonerated by the French government in 1906. Gallant refers to the Dreyfus project in her handwritten comments to my February 1982 letter, asking that I not pursue the subject with her. So I didn't. Now I am also asking you, 43 years later, not to pursue that subject with me. Thank you very much. For now, here is the introduction of an introduction to Home Truths with an advisory. I have been reading and rereading this passage now for over 40 years. It might be the passage I have reread most from Gallant, save for the ending of her story or novella, The Muslim Wife, from which I pilfered the title for my 1988 book on Gallant. I have failed time and again, really every time, to read this closing passage from an introduction without choking up. Spare me, please, the psychobabylitic explanation for my perennial response. Here's the passage. This is Gallant. At the same time, I suppose about then, there began to be restored in some underground river of the mind a lost Montreal. An image of Sherbrooke Street at night with the soft gaslight and leaf shadows on the sidewalk so far back in childhood that it is more a sensation than a picture, was the starting point. Behind this image was the fictional structure of several stories in the order in which they are presented here, 3 wartime stories, then the rest. The character I called Lynette Muir is not an exact reflection. I saw her as quite another person, but it would be untrue to say that I invented everything. I can vouch for the city. My Montreal is as accurate as memory can make it. I looked nothing up, feeling that if I made a mistake with a street name, it had to stand. Memory can spell a name wrong and still convey the truth. I made it. Gallant's writing for the Montreal Standard was focused on the Montreal that the character Lynette Muir lived and dreamed, worked in, and imagined and remembered, with excursions in the Lynette Muir stories further back into Lynette's childhood. Lynette's memory, like Gallant's memory, might well have got the occasional street name wrong. Gallant's Montreal, the Montreal so present to us in her work for the Standard and re-presented again in the Lynette Muir stories and many others, was, as Lynette Muir puts it, finally the only Montreal there is. Here's Lynette narrating at the end of the story in Youth is Pleasure, first published in the New Yorker in the issue of November 24th, 1975. The way it's close to the end of the story. One day, standing at the corner, waiting for the light to change, I understood that the Sherbrooke street of my exile, my Mecca, my Jerusalem, was this. It had to be. There could not be two. It was only this. That's one compelling reason to revisit, or just as useful in its way, to read Gallant's Montreal Standard journalism for the first time, and then to read or reread her stories as one must, as I, for one, just did in one iteration this last fall when I taught 6 Mavis Gallant stories to a seniors class at the University of Winnipeg. It was wonderful. We began with the other Paris and ended with the Muslim wife, discovering again, or as if for the first time, how closely Carol Fraser's inclinations to blockade her historical experience of post-war Paris and marry her stolid American fiancé Howard align with Netta Asher's decision in The Muslim Wife to take back the errant Jack Ross, her husband, to let his errant memory stand. Netta Asher is the so-called Muslim wife of the story's title. I like to think that it is this story. I have no real evidence. It could be one of 50 Gallant stories that Michael Ondaatje had in mind when he wrote, quote, "There is more going on in a Mavis Gallant story than in any 5 novels." Ondaatje is right. Read or reread Gallant's stories and read her Montreal Standard pieces. You'll see. Thank you.